Thanks for having me back again, this time to talk about the red vestments and paraments that I made for you. Last time I explained some of the design sources that related to your own church building and your Scandinavian origins. Of course, these still apply for these red vestments, and some of the features are repeated, such as the zigzag border along the bottom edge of the altar frontal. On my visit to you last October, I had admired the lovely red doors with their impressive hinges, and so for making this set I wanted to reference that, both through colour and style. I was blessed on that visit with beautiful autumn sunshine and a most impressive display of fall colours. The trees certainly put on a good show, and as I went for a walk on my first morning, I couldn't help but pick up a few fallen leaves and sit and paint them. Even this little creature had a lovely red glow, as did the sunrise that day. Coming back to the designs, St. Martin's cross from Iona had worked well on the purple vestments, so I decided to use that again for this red set. This time I used the other face of the cross, the west face. This depicts various biblical scenes. In the centre is the Nativity with the Virgin and Child, surrounded by angels, flanked on the arms of the cross by lions. Above them are some zoomorphic creatures. They may be lions, hounds, or serpents, it's difficult to determine. Just below the Nativity is Daniel in the lion's den, then Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, followed by David playing the harp, opposite a man playing the triple pipes. The lowest row of figures remains unidentified. I also decided to stick with the square crosses from the Viking rune stones, as I'd used on the purple set, and with the knotwork surrounding them in that style. The occasions when red vestments are used are few, the main one being Pentecost. They may also be used for martyr saints' days and sometimes for ordinations. The thing that all these occasions have in common is the coming of the Holy Spirit. Red is said to represent the tongues of flame seen to rest above each of the apostles at that first Pentecost. So, how to represent the Holy Spirit? In European art, it is often represented as a descending dove, but in the Celtic tradition, it is shown as a wild goose. Not for them the gentle cooing dove, predictable and soft. The Holy Spirit was a glorious wild goose, dynamic, free, and utterly uncontrollable. They would see these geese flying overhead, riding the wind, with a raucous noise that called to the spirit within them, and they saw the Holy Spirit of God. The wild goose reveals a spirit which is passionate, noisy, and courageous. This symbol reminds us that God's Spirit cannot be tamed or contained. We go where the Spirit takes us. I would like to thank my sister for these photographs of our most common goose here in Scotland, the grey lag. I gather that geese can be something of a problem in Minnesota, but you have them in abundance, and I am sure you can understand this way of representing the Holy Spirit. So it was agreed to have this symbol worked within the Celtic knotwork. On the first Pentecost, the 12 apostles, and there were 12, Judas had been replaced by Matthias by this time, were gathered together, and the Holy Spirit came to them as a rushing wind, with tongues of flame resting above each. I decided to keep the knotwork quite free-flowing, conveying this image, but I wanted to represent each of the apostles. In the days before literacy was common, symbols were used to tell stories. For the disciples, each has his own symbol, relating either to his life or the manner of his death, sometimes both. These symbols are set within knotwork that balances the knotwork surrounding the goose, and each has a little flame-like protrusion illustrating their presence at the first Pentecost. Andrew is represented by his original profession as a fisherman, along with the saltire cross on which he was martyred. Bartholomew was flayed alive, hence the knives, laid on the open Bible because of his work preaching about the life of Jesus. There were two Jameses. The terms great and less refer to seniority, not status. James the Great travelled widely, preaching the gospel, and has come to be associated with pilgrimage. According to legend, James's body was transported to Spain on a boat made of a single scallop shell, which is why the scallop shell became the symbol of pilgrimage. James the Less was responsible for Christians of Judea after St. Peter left for Rome. He was stoned and clubbed before his body was sawn in half. John was the author of St. John's Gospel, along with the book of Revelation. He was the only one of the apostles who did not die a martyr's death, but lived to an old age. As his gospel concentrated on the divine nature of Christ, his symbol is an eagle, a creature close to heaven. Jude, in some places referred to as Thaddeus or Judas not Iscariot, is often represented in art with a flame to show that he was indeed present at the first Pentecost. He was reputedly clubbed to death. Matthew was a tax collector before being called to follow Jesus, hence the symbol of money bags. There is debate as to whether or not he is the same Matthew that was the author of the Gospel, who in that context would be portrayed as the winged man. Matthias was the disciple chosen to replace Judas Iscariot. After Pentecost, he preached the Gospel widely in Judea and Colchis. His symbol is an open Bible with a battle axe. He was stoned and then beheaded. Peter is represented by crossed keys. He was the disciple to whom Jesus entrusted the keys of the kingdom, saying, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Philip's symbol is the Tau cross above a basket. The basket refers to the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. He died by crucifixion. Simon the Zealot, to distinguish from Simon Peter, in some accounts was the bridegroom at the wedding where Jesus performed his first miracle, changing water into wine. He preached the gospel in both Egypt and Persia. The Bible is the symbol of his preaching, the fish a symbol of Christianity. And finally, Thomas. He was a builder and is represented with a set square or ruler. The spears symbolize the manner of his martyrdom. For the superfrontal, we decided to depict the gifts of the Holy Spirit. There are various listings of what these gifts are, but they usually revolve around the listing in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Some are easier to depict than others. Some can be interpreted in different ways, perhaps reflecting that we all experience the gifts of the Holy Spirit in different ways in our lives. In the centre, I used the same runestone cross as was used on the purple vestments. One of the gifts is listed as fear of God, not as in worry about punishment, but more as not wanting to disappoint or let God down. This is normally symbolised by a cross. Another gift is wisdom, shown as an owl in many different cultures. Healing is depicted as a snake coiled around a staff, coming from the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verses 4 to 9, and is a symbol that has come to be used by many organisations involved with healing, including the World Health Organization. The open book represents knowledge. Fortitude is represented as a pillar, signifying the ability to hold up and strengthen others. The scales represent counsel and the need to balance the arguments. And finally, piety is represented by a monk wearing a scapular and kneeling in prayer. Each of these symbols is accompanied here by a flying wild goose, confirming that they are indeed gifts of the Holy Spirit. The same flying geese and flame motifs are used to create the orphreys on the chasuble, along with a small version of the St. Martin cross. and the same style is used on the stoles, berths and veil. These vestments and paraments were generously gifted in memory of Dr. Bruce Steinhauer, who dedicated his life to using the gift of healing and went willingly wherever the Holy Spirit took him. Now I want to take you on a brief tour of my studio and the process involved in making these vestments and paraments. The first step was to paint the applique fabric. This is a fine silk called habitoy. When I made the purple vestments in January, I had to work indoors and was limited by space, so had to paint up 3 smaller pieces. This time it was spring, and I decided to work outdoors so I could work on 1 large piece. I had calculated that I needed to paint 5.5 meters of silk. This time I didn't want the colours all to blend together with soft edges. I wanted some sharp lines and definition, rather like the edges of the leaves that inspired the colour palette. I started randomly splashing a special colourless paint that would stop subsequent layers from bleeding through the silk. This had to dry before I could start working with colours, but as it was a very windy day, that process was fast. Then I added the colours, starting with yellows and then adding golds, oranges, reds and some browns, till I had the effect I was looking for. By the time I had finished, the wind had seriously picked up, and I was concerned that the whole thing was going to take off. One of your congregation, Kathy Gillam, had kindly sent me a photograph she had taken of some fall trees, and I was pleased when I laid it beside my silk to see that the colours went well. After painting, the colours had to be heat fixed, so this was done using my heat press. Then the silk could be washed to remove the original flow resist, which had stiffened the fabric. The washing made it softer and more flexible, and following this I stabilised the silk by using an iron-on woven interfacing, and then I was ready to cut out all the applique pieces using my laser cutter. The noise you hear in the background is actually one of the embroidery machines running, rather than the noise of the laser machine, although it is quite loud. And now you can see the cut out pieces ready for applying to the fabric. Here you see the waste silk that's left behind, and then the pieces that I want are sprayed with a spray adhesive ready to apply to the main fabric. The embroidery designs are created in such a way that the machine will first stitch an outline of the applique shape so that I can position the cutouts. Then it is set to do a catch down stitch, quickly going round the cut edges to make sure nothing else slips out of place before the decorative embroidery begins. And here you see me positioning the pieces and carefully pushing them down. This is slightly speeded up. I don't do it as fast as this. This is using a bit of time-lapse photography. Once the stitching is complete, I do a check to make sure that everything has stitched as it should before removing it from the frame, just in case there's anything that needs to be corrected. With all the embroidery complete, the next step was to weave the fringes. The first part of this involves creating a very high twist yarn that will twist together when doubled back on itself. It was all done with fine embroidery threads selected to match the colours of the silk, brocade and embroidery. In total I had 17 strands of yarn, which I plied together using my spinning wheel, running them through a yarn counter so that I knew I had made 256 metres. When I made the purple vestments, I had calculated that I needed 6.5 metres of fringes, and allowing for loom waste, warp take-up, initial testing and potential mistakes, I made a warp of 9 metres in length. My calculations had been spot on, but there wasn't a spare inch left, so this time I decided to make the warp a bit longer to give me more to play with. The warping frame stakes are set at 3 metres apart, so next size up was 12 metres. That would be plenty. Walking up and down, following the path until I had enough strands to set up the loom. 32 times 4, half in red, half in gold. I van transferred the warp onto the loom and started threading each group of 4 threads through the heddles, working in order so that I had a pattern to work to. All the fringes had to be sewn on by hand. It's the kind of thing where if you do it on the sewing machine, you get uneven stretching of fabric and fringe, with puckers resulting, and you end up unpicking everything and sewing it on by hand anyway, so much better to take the slow route. One calculation had gone adrift somewhere, and I found myself with insufficient painted silk left to line the veil, so I had to do a bit of patchwork. Fortunately, apart from that, everything went smoothly, and the vestments were all parcelled up and sent across the Atlantic, arriving in time for their first use on the Feast of Pentecost. My thanks to Mary for sending me photographs of everything in use.